Music theory, why we should number the 12 notes in our musical alphabet. Remembering our general approach is to ask the question, if we were to put together our musical system today, having known all the information that we have gleaned over the years, would we put together the same system that we're currently using, a system constructed as we had gleaned the knowledge, building on itself over time? My hypothesis? No, we would not. We would make something way better at this point in time. And I think basically we can make the argument to prove that to a fair jury. And if that is the case, if we can think of a system that would be more simplified, easier to learn, then the question, of course, would be, well, if I learned something in a more clean kind of way, a faster way, would the benefits outweigh the cons, which is, for example, communication and so on, bridging the gap between the two systems. So that's what we want to apply to the concept here of taking our musical alphabet and thinking about a numbering system with it. Now, you can come up with an argument saying that we should just replace the letters with the numbers. That might be the most efficient thing to do if we were to build it from scratch. I'm basically thinking here that we can't really eliminate the letters because, in part, that's the historical way it's been put together. But when you're learning, you probably want to, I would highly recommend, assign some kind of numbering system because, and I'll explain the rationale for that here. Now, I think this is just so painfully obvious that I feel like it shouldn't even have to be said, but sometimes people get upset with these kind of ideas when you try to propose this kind of stuff because I think it goes on tradition. This is the traditional language or something like that. So I feel like we have to basically make the argument that if you're learning music theory from scratch here, you're doing any kind of music, I would say you would want to learn some kind of numbering system along with the letters. Now, this is the one I have put together. You can argue how you should number it, meaning should you make the A a 0 and then count up from 0, or should I make the C the 1, or should I make C 0? So there's different numbering systems that you can argue for, which I might get into shortly, but some kind of numbering system I think is just obviously, clearly beneficial and will help you advance better. So general things on how in the world can anyone really argue that that is not the case if you just look at the system the way it is here, right? Because if you were to just say the notes in the alphabet, I can't even sing the alphabet, right? It's like A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D, E. You can't even sing the alphabet going one way, let alone counting it backwards. I mean, try to say the alphabet backwards even without the sharps and flats, right? And try to sing the alphabet backwards. You have to do that on the fretboard. You have to count upwards and backwards oftentimes when you're trying to figure something out. Now add the sharps and flats in there and try to count upwards and backwards. You're going to have to use your fingers. You're going to have to take your hand off the fretboard and count on your fingers to try to figure out the distance from one note to the other. Not only that, but when I count up, you're supposed to do sharps, and when I count back, you're supposed to do flats. Now, I'm going to get into why this happened, but I just want to just to point out, that's kind of weird, right? I mean, so now when I'm going up, I have to call this an A sharp, even though it's the same note, and then B. But if I was going back the other way, I got to call it a B flat. So now I have two names for the same note. Now, how in the world could that possibly be like an efficient system? And some people, and so there's kind of cool things that come about this, that come from it. And one of the things is kind of interesting, for example, is that when we apply our formula and we make our scale formulas, it's pretty neat that you can say, hey, look, all of the scales that we make, all of the normal scales actually have every note in the alphabet. It's got A through G. They're all spelled out A through G. Isn't that cool? And it's like, well, yeah, that is cool. That sounds like, it looks like a magical thing. But wait, how do you do that? Well, then you just have to go in through there and find how many sharps and flats are in the scale. And then you've got to apply the sharps and flats to the proper notes in the scale. So you're saying, so that means that in order for all the scales to have the letters A through G. All you had to do was give two names to at least half of the notes, because sometimes even like these notes, we say it's a sharp or flat, even though there's not even a name for the sharp or flat. So you had to give two names to like at least half of the notes and have them have two names in order to make that happen, right? That doesn't outweigh the pros, do not outweigh the cons, just from like a systems perspective, in my view. And I feel like, just to explain this, like, I feel like this is kind of like if you're sitting on a beach and by a creek and you're looking at the bank on the other side, which is like a rock or something, and you might have ingested like some mushrooms that are doing weird things, and you're looking at the cliff face and you're like, dude, there's patterns in the cliff face. There's patterns, man. The cliff is talking to me. And I'm not even putting that down really, because there are patterns, and the cliff kind of is talking because there is like a formula that the way the water happened on the cliff and the rain made stuff happen on the cliff. So there is patterns there. And if you look at it long enough, you're going to start to find cool formulas and things about it. Similarly here, this isn't the most efficient system, but if you stare at it long enough, if you play with it long enough, you find cool things about it, right? You can kind of make up cool things, the way the sharps, how many sharps and flats are in particular keys, which keys have the sharps and flats in them, how do you spell a particular thing this way and that way. But all of that, I don't think you can possibly argue that those cool things are going to outweigh the complexity that has been added by not numbering and not even having an order of the alphabet of the notes. That's going to be the argument. Now, the only argument I can kind of see that might be rational is you say, well, look, it's a different language, and that language has resulted in beautiful expression, even if we don't really know why, even if it's not logical, it's not the most efficient thing. It's kind of like speaking a different language. Like if you're a French speaker, the French language is just beautiful. Doesn't matter if you can't spell it, right? I'm obviously speaking English. I can't even spell the French words in English. Like I admit restaurant sounds good and garage sounds good, but I can't spell them. I want to call it a car hole and like feed your face place or something like that. It rhymes and stuff. I know that's not as sophisticated and whatnot, but see, so you could make an argument like maybe the language is doing something to create the music, and I get that. So that might be like a valid argument. But the thing that I don't like really is that this complexity creates a barrier to entry. And I'm not sure if there's any intention that has happened on that over time, or if that's just something that kind of drew out over time. But I do know that music is kind of one of those things that used to be an aristocratic kind of thing. Like the peasants couldn't really do music. They're working all the time. They can't really figure out how do you keep something restricted as though it's only for a certain group of people. You make bureaucracy, right? You make it complicated. And so I kind of feel like there might be some of that in our music system, which I really don't like. I don't like that kind of thing, right? You should make it accessible to people by getting rid of the bureaucracy. That's what I tend to kind of think. It's kind of like even in a capitalist system here, like how do the big companies try to hold down competition? You can become somewhat socialistic or communistic, right? You go to the government and say, government, put in all these rules and regulations, which look like they hurt me, but they don't really hurt me because I can jump through the hoops. It just takes out the little guys, right? Similarly here, I kind of feel like, if you made a more simple system, then it might not be as cool because you're not on the in crowd, has to go through the initiation rites of jumping through all the hurdles they jump through the pointless hoops of bureaucracy to be part of the in crowd. Seems kind of like there might be some of that here, and I don't really like that. I'd rather say more people be accessible. I mean, it'd be kind of interesting if more people understood music a little bit more. We might have like the normal modern music might be not just a bass beat that people grind against each other to, right? It's just so raw. It's like, you could have a little bit more nuance and it'd still work. You don't need it. It doesn't need to be like And I get, like the explicitness versus non-explicit is just a trend thing this way and that way. But I kind of feel like simplifying it would be better. So I want to do like the thing like that the printing press did for like the Bible, right? You want to make, not by putting it on paper to get it out there, but to make the language easier for more people to understand, faster. I think that's generally the way to go. Anyway, that's my argument. Removes redundancy. So obviously the traditional note names, let's just go through this step by step. You've got sharps and flats. That, again, you can kind of argue like some things, some different voicings but I don't think there's anything that you can basically say that makes any sense if you were to build the system today to have two names for multiple notes and to have a system that you can't count up and backwards very easily. So with numbers 1 to 12, each pitch gets a unique ID, no inharmonic duplicates. So the way things are taught oftentimes today is like as if there's some kind of magical benefit to these two names for the same note. And I really don't think there is, other than like you can say, well, the scale, again, all the scales have all the same letters, and then you know where the sharps and flats are, and there's a cool kind of symmetry to that just happened to result from having a system that's more complex than it needs to be, but you have this cool result that happens from it, and so on. So make intervals simple math. So if you need to know the interval between C and G. So let's just say you're on a guitar. Let's say you're on two different strings, and I'm trying to say what's the distance between the C and the G. And I can't count it up because I'm not on a piano. I just can't count the notes. I have to count it out the letters in my head. Oh, well, that's not fine. You just sing the alphabet. C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, and make sure that you take your hands off of the guitar so that you can use your fingers, because there's no way that you're going to be able to say that while also counting in your mind, right? And what if I'm going backwards? What if I'm going from the G back to the C? Well, then you don't do that. Then you just pretend that you're going this way. You make that the root and you go this. But no, you could go backwards, but then you have to know the alphabet backward. You just sing the alphabet backwards. It's not hard. You just go G, but then make sure that you don't call this one an F sharp, because now you're going backwards. It's a G flat. So you got to say this is G, G flat, F, E. Make sure you don't have, there's no F flat, by the way. E flat, D, and make sure you're counting on your fingers. So do you see how that's just absurd? So again, the numbering system would help a lot. So I'm not saying we can remove the letters per se. We've got to take a middle road here. But if we have some kind of numbering system that I can code switch and say that a C is a 4 and then a G is an 11, then I can say, okay, 11 minus 4, right? And then I can say, okay, and then I can see the distance more clearly. So we're going to have to be able to code switch between the numbers and the letters. I think that's the in-between road that we can take, because I don't think we can simply eliminate the letters, although you could kind of these days because you have ChatGPT and whatnot. But I think, that possibly is going too far. Anyways, a minor third, just add 3. So when we get into intervals later, this will become important, because the interval names often don't have the actual half steps included in them. I'd like to include the half steps. If you include the half steps, the actual distance, you can do simple math. I'm not talking complicated math. We're not doing calculus. We're not even counting. Really, we're not even adding and subtracting more than like a one-digit number normally, right? That's the math we're talking about here that would be really useful. If you want the invert a chord, you just take 12 minus. There's 12 notes. So you take 12 minus it, you get the inverted item. We'll talk more about this in future presentations, but I'm just saying that would be useful to do. You can't do it with letters, especially when you're trying to count the letters on your fingers while your fingers are supposed to be on the fretboard. And okay, fretboard logic becomes transparent. So on the guitar, other stringed instruments, spatial relationships are consistent, meaning it's like a spreadsheet. It's all symmetrical. A numbering system lets you see the replicate these relationships with math. So clearly, I think like a lot of people have issues with making music mathematical. They don't really like that. Possibly that might be some of the thing, but it clearly has mathematical implications. There's symmetry to it. And like the Greeks used to say, the ancient Greeks, basically, music was one of the fundamental things you had to basically learn. It was a basic thing that you kind of had to learn. And I think that's because they thought of it as logic. It's logic based. You should be learning music as you do. The kids should be learning it with their math because it's logic based. And we've kind of wanted to make it aesthetic, completely aesthetic, without any of the logic underpinning to it. And I don't think that's probably not useful. It should be a fun tool to learn, relationships. So great for software and data. So obviously these days we've got software that we would want to put things into possibly. It would be easier to do with, of course, a numbering system. Now, this is another one where people are going to say, well, look, you're making something that's supposed to be aesthetically pleasing, and now you are trying to put it into a computer code and whatnot, that's not what it's about, man. But I'm just saying, if something can be coded more simply in Excel or in some kind of database program, that's an indication that you're not thinking about it as cleanly, right? You're thinking about it too complexly. What we want to do is free up our mind from thinking about things in a more complex way. It's more complex to try to see the difference between a G and a C by counting whole steps and half steps and whatnot with sharps and flats than by doing simple math. I want to do it the easiest way possible so then I can think about the aesthetic part. I have to free up my mind to concentrate on the aesthetics by making everything else as automatic as possible. You make it as automatic as possible by making it as simple as possible. That seems the way to go to me. So sorting, transposing, analyzing chords takes one line of code or formula. So again, even if you're not into that, we will look a little bit on Excel. I'll show you exactly what I mean, but hopefully, even if you're not into that kind of thing, you can see that the logic that I have to go through in Excel will be far simplified, and that's the same logic that your mind is having to go through in order to figure this stuff out. So you want to make it easy. So why it's better for learning. So new learners struggle with the messy mix of letters, sharps, flats, theory, exceptions. So this is the thing that, again, kind of bothers me. It looks to me like this is bureaucratic, just mumbo jumbo. Now, maybe I'm thinking about it wrong. That's just the way it happened to grow up over time. And it's not like an elite club thing, but it looks like an elite club thing, right? It looks like a thing we're putting a barrier to entry by putting up things that are more complicated than they need to be, and you've got to jump through the hurdles if you want to join the club. And I don't like that. It should be you want more people to understand it, the better, and that will result in it'll be better. The number system cuts through confusion. So there are 12 notes, not 7 letters, and a dozen modifications. So obviously, just learning this, like, it's ridiculous. There's 12 notes. Like, there's not 12 notes plus you got to know if there's a sharp and flat, plus you got to know if you're going up versus down. Like, that's ridiculous. I mean, like, the added complication that is included just on the baseline level of learning it seems kind of silly. Now, I'll get into possibly why that happened historically shortly. So it's a clean circle, not a tangle of inharmonics and historical leftovers. So kids learning math can use the same skills to understand intervals, chords, and scales. So again, the Greeks used to do this. The ancient Greeks would say music is fundamental to education. It's something everybody should kind of learn to be well-rounded or whatever. And like I say, why would that be the case? It's because you have logical relationships. It's basically ratios that you're dealing with different pitches, which translates into math beautifully, particularly if we use a numbering system, right? So we started with, so how did this happen? So I'm going to think that the primary instrument that we were using back in the day is going to be a piano, right? Now, why did we shape the piano the way we did? We're probably saying, we were dealing with vocal sound before that, you would think. And then we're like, we can build everything out in one key as our main key to simplify things. So if I'm trying to simplify things and I don't have a lot of resources, I don't have a computer, I don't have multiple instruments, no one's learning how to play a guitar that's too complicated looking at the time or whatever, we're just going to make a piano that lists it out like a keyboard, and it lists out the one key, meaning the 7 notes in the key of C. That's really cool because if you play a piano, then you can play, just playing in the key of C, all of the white notes, you can come up with a lot of cool stuff because that is one diatonic key with just those notes, and all the notes that you play should sound good. So if you could just translate that to the guitar, if you could just find those notes on the guitar, that would be cool because if you just play those notes, you can come up with an endless amount of things there. But over time, of course, we started to say, well, we want to play in multiple different keys because we have the capacity to do that. We're not limited anymore. We've got things that we can learn on the internet, different ways to learn things. So it used to be, you would think, we're going to teach people how to play in one key, and then if they want to expand from there, we'll teach them the other stuff and so on and so forth. But by doing that, you're creating limitations like you do with math when you have a shortcut, a heuristic that only works on one level of math but doesn't expand to the broader math that you're going to learn later. You've actually built a wall. You've made something more difficult by making an artificial rule that doesn't apply universally. That's what's happening with the learning right now, right? We're learning 7 notes as though those 7 notes are somehow special, as though C major is somehow special other than just simply being historically special. And then you can imagine, well, what if we numbered this, or if we lettered them with 7 letters, then what are we going to do when we add the other lettering system? You can see what it looks like it happens. They just squished the other notes in between. So that with the numbering system, this would be just like if you were doing accounting and you came up with a chart of accounts, but you numbered them 1 through 10, and then you said, oh no, I need to put something in between the 1 and the 2. What am I going to do? I have to name it like 1.5. I didn't leave any room, except they did it with letters. So you got A and the B. What am I going to put in between? I'd have to put A.5, right? That doesn't make, so you see, but then they said, well, I can't call it A.5 because it's right in between. Because if I went the other way, it's just as close to a B as it is to the A. So why would I call it an A.5 and not a B-5 or something like that? And I happen to notice that if I make all of my scales, then on every note, starting on every note, I could make it so that there's one note, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, of every scale, if I just nudge like these notes to either an A or a B. I might have to nudge the actual B itself too, even though it doesn't have to be nudged normally. But if I do that, you see what's happening here? So now we kind of force this thing to work. You would think that's how it basically came about, you would think, right? So that doesn't seem exactly like the best way to go. It just seems like that we already had a system. We had our general ledger account was numbered in a not optimal way, and then we did the best we could with it. We stuffed in the other account numbers and called them 1.5 and whatnot, and that's what we're left with. Instead of just redoing the system and saying, well, look, we need to redo it because we didn't leave any numbers that would allow us to redo it. We don't want to do that because that won't match the prior numbers. I won't be able to compare it to last year if I do that, right? And we have a similar kind of thing here that's happening. So I think, to me, that looks like all that's happening. That's why we're kind of left with what's happening from a practical standpoint, it seems to me. So the modern system evolved from the piano. It was easiest to name the white keys, right? We just named the white keys, and the sharps and flats were tacked on as black keys. So they were kind of put into the middle. Now, again, in reality, there's no difference between any of the keys. They're all equal, you would think, from a modern standpoint. There's not one key that's like somehow better just like naturally than the other keys. It's kind of like physics, where we're saying the perspective that we're looking at is the right perspective. But no, the perspectives are all relative. You should be able to look from every other perspective. The way you're approaching the problem is being biased towards a particular kind of perspective. It should all be even, right? All the keys should be even, right? Now on the piano, there's logistical issues. You don't want all the keys the same size because then your hand's not big enough to stretch. But even then you would think like which keys should be shrunk, which keys, it's kind of random the way that happened, right? They kind of came up with, we're going to make the piano in one key and then we're going to stick in the other keys in a way that it doesn't make the fingers have to stretch too far, right? Is that the most optimal thing? I don't know. I don't want to get into that. Piano's not my instrument, but there it is. So music theory developed backward from the physical layout of the keyboard. So you can see, like, again, does that sound like it's the most efficient way to build it? Like there was some magic way that they discovered like something that's better than the most, like the simplest system? Or does it just sound like they just were building on top of what they already have, like having a general ledger account that didn't have any space when you started adding more accounts to it, so you had to start adding funny account numbers? Okay, so C major bias. So now, of course, when the piano is in the key of C, you end up with a lot of songs played in, the key of C, of course, and it starts to sound like those are what they call like the natural notes, which again puts an artificial emphasis on them. Whereas if we were looking at it from a modern perspective, now that we have all these other tools that we can use, we probably don't want to get that in our mind. We don't want to think like, I need to learn this scale before I can learn the other scales, when all the scales are basically the same in structure, right? And is the idea. So most theory starts with the C major because it's the simplest on the piano. So as a result, the entire system is built around an arbitrary visual simplification. So why hasn't it been widely used? So why don't we use a numbering system? Well, inertia. So Western music theory was locked into the naming long before. So now, before we had computers and all this stuff, this was in place. So once again, it's in the textbooks, it's in the theory. It's just like if you have a general ledger account that already has the numbering system, you don't want to change it because then you can't compare it to the prior period as easily. It becomes messy. So that's what the problem is. But now we have the ability to use computers and all this other stuff. So now the question is, would making it easier be useful? And if it would, then do the pros outweigh the cons? And I feel like the pros of just simply adding numbers clearly outweighs the cons just for you as a learner to learn it, because the only added problem you have to do is to be able to transpose between the number and the letter. I'd have to come up with some numbering system and then be able to transpose between key change between the letter and the number, allowing me to do simple math. So that would be the general idea. Now I want a quick touch on the numbering system itself. So you can argue for different numbering systems. If you're a coder or something like that, you're going to say maybe you should have made the A 0 and then you should have numbered it up from 0. Now, why is that often the case? Maybe if you're in a coding kind of system, because you want to number you want to number the steps. So that would mean if I go from 0, it would be a step to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and so on. That would be the general way that you would do it. Or you might say, I should start with the C as number 1, because historically C has been kind of like the center point, even though it's not the A, which is the first letter of the alphabet. So what you would think, if C was their master 1, why didn't they make it A, you would think, So you could say I should make C either the 1 or the 0 maybe, and then count up from there. So different software might use different conventions. So I don't know what the exact best convention is. I argue for A, or I used A as 1, because I think that's the easiest for most people to convert to, although they still have problems. So because if they go to the 2, you would think the 2 would be a B, because if you numbered the alphabet, it would be a B, but now you got a sharp and a flat, so there's no way to get past some kind of messiness with the numbering system. But I just think it's pretty easy to just go 1 through 12 on the numbering system. I don't see any problem with the off by one issue that kind of coders will have, but maybe there's an issue with it. I think that any numbering system is going to give you at least some simple math, and this one I think is a logical one because A, you would think would be A1, you would think would be the logical place, matching it to the alphabet to start off with. Now that off by one problem, however, is an issue that we will come into when we get to like the chord creation and when we get into scales, because what we'll create from this is, you'll remember, the next layer, which will be the actual chords in a scale, which that's the point where I, instead of renumbering that system, I'd like to give it a nodal numbering system, right? And so we'll get into that basically later, but just want to point that out now. So guitar's a lead instrument. Spreadsheet learning is now available. So changing the system would have meant overhauling sheet music, textbooks, and education. So that becomes the issue. So remember, there's multiple reasons why that's the issue. One's a legitimate reason, because I want to make it easy to communicate. So I want to make things, from my perspective, I want to make things as transparent so as many people can interact with it as much as possible. If you change the system, then the argument is you can't interact with the past anymore because they have different systems. That's a legitimate argument. But nowadays, of course, you have ways to transpose things. So in this case, I would say you want to learn both. But if there is a change, you can clearly use ChatGTP or something like that to make the change. So what if we built music theory from scratch today? So what would we do? Like if you were to clean the slate and say, I'm just going to build a system that's the cleanest system possible, right? I'm just going to take away all the baggage and just say, I'm just trying to build a clean system. What would we do? Well, we'd start by acknowledging 12 equal tones in the chromatic system, meaning I'm not going to say that C is somehow superior than the other notes, right? I'm just going to say they're all equivalent, right? They're all equivalent. You might like to play in one versus the other, but in theory, they're all the same, basically. They're even, right? We don't want to create a false bias on one or the other just from a theory standpoint, just like numbering, just normal numbers. You don't want to create a false, 7's the best number. Well, that's numerology. You might as well be doing tarot cards or something, right? That's like not exact. It's not. There's nothing fundamentally better about the number, right? So we'd number them 1 through 12. Again, you could argue 0 through 12 from a systems perspective, but I'm going to go 1 through 12 here, just like we do with hours on a clock or positions on a wheel, which again might start at 0, but I'm going to start at 1. So we'd use a modular math. So intervals equals subtraction. So that allows us to do, obviously, subtractions easily. Transposition equals addition, and inversion 12 minus x to inverse something because there's 12 notes. So we layer modes, chords, and scales over the clean framework. So now you have when you start to put the modes in and the chords and the scales, now it's layered over something that doesn't have multiple names to it and whatnot. And your foundation now being clean will mean that everything you build from it, the scales will not have multiple names and whatnot, or less likely to. The modes and the chords and everything that you build, everything we built from here was built off of a foundation that's way more messy than it needs to be, right? So that's why we end up with all these weird names. So in short, we build music theory with numbers, not letters. It's the general idea. We now use, so the time is a good time right now. Why? Because now we have software like MIDI, which is already numbered based. Again, you can argue about how did they use C as 0, C as 1, A as 1, or whatever. But we have the DOS and software visual plus numerical. So obviously any of the database programs that are being used are basically, of course, doing this because this is the conversion you have to do. I'm not saying that you need to be a coder. I'm saying that if the coding is doing that, it's because its brain is doing something easier than what your brain is trying to do, because your system that you're using is more complex. It's an indication that your system's more complex. Guitar and piano apps, so spreadsheets, AI, all have the capacity to help out. We can do simple math if you do this on a spreadsheet as well, which again, if you're trying to analyze music theory, is great. So why the time is right, the traditional note names are useful for tradition, but if we want to learn faster, think cleaner, and create more more flexibility, so numbering the notes, 12 notes, is the most powerful system we've never been taught. So that's what we want to do typically. So again, I don't think you can eliminate I wouldn't suggest that if you're learning music, you're going to say, well, I'm just not going to learn the note names at all. That's going to make it more difficult because then you will have to translate everything. But I think it's way worth your time to learn a numbering system along with the notes and be able to code switch back and forth between them, allowing you the capacity to use simple math in spreadsheets as well as your brain when you're trying to figure things out. And again, just try to say this alphabet forwards and backwards and get the sharps and flats correct and not use your fingers to see how far, and you tell me, like, it's just obvious, okay? It's just obvious that that's ridiculous. Okay.